Yesterday, on the 23rd of June, Vladimir Putin addressed the graduates of Russia's top military academies in the same George Hall of the Kremlin. This is, on its surface, a ceremonial occasion. It happens every year around this time because this is also the week in which Russia commemorates the German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd of June 1941. Every year, young officers graduate, the president gives a speech, and the speech is usually filled with the kind of language you would expect: pride in the armed forces, gratitude to the fallen, confidence in the nation's defense. I want to suggest to you that this year's speech was not usual, and that if you read it carefully, alongside everything else that has been said by Russian officials in the last 2 weeks, you arrive at a conclusion that very few people in Europe or America seem willing to sit with. The Russian state believes a war with the West, not merely with Ukraine, is a live possibility, and it is organizing itself accordingly. Let me walk through why I think this, and then put it in context. Because a single speech, however striking, is not evidence of anything on its own. What gives it weight is the pattern around it. Putin began, as he always does at this kind of event, with the special military operation itself. He praised the officers and soldiers fighting in Ukraine, said they were liberating, in his words, historic Russian lands, and protecting the Russian people. This is a familiar formula by now, roughly 4.5 years into the invasion, and the language has calcified into ritual. I do not think we should spend much time on it, except to note one thing. The phrase, historic Russian lands, is doing more work than it appears to. Putin did not define the territory, and he never does in speeches of this kind, because defining it would commit him to a negotiating position. It is worth remembering, as a matter of historical fact, that the Russian nationalist case for territorial claims on Ukraine does not stop at the 4 regions Moscow has formally annexed. There is an older idea, going back to the 17th century, of what used to be called Left Bank Ukraine, the territory east of the Dnipro, including Kharkiv, Sumy, Chernihiv, Poltava. Some Russian nationalists consider this fundamentally Russian soil. I do not think Putin was making a coded territorial announcement yesterday, but the looseness of the phrase is itself a choice, one that keeps maximal options on the table rather than closing them down. But the territorial question was not really the point of the speech. The point of the speech, the part that I think deserves close attention, was what Putin said about what he called the West, not just Europe, not just NATO, but the West as a single entity that he explicitly linked together. According to readouts and analysis that circulated within hours of the speech, Putin told the assembled officers that NATO countries have moved beyond merely supporting Kyiv and are now, in his words, openly preparing for war with Russia, using fabricated claims of a Russian threat to justify rearmament and what he called the militarization of their societies. He then did what he often does, which is reach for history. He invoked the run-up to the Second World War, drawing a parallel between what he sees as Western fear-mongering today and the propaganda that, in the Soviet telling, preceded earlier Western aggression against Russia. And separately, in commentary that has now appeared from people who watched the speech closely, there is a reading that this was, in substance, a warning to the West, that Russia does not intend to repeat the mistake that made Operation Barbarossa possible in 1941, the mistake of being caught unprepared. That is a serious thing to say out loud on the anniversary of the day the Wehrmacht crossed the Soviet border to the very cadets who are about to become officers in that army. Now, I'll be careful here, because the temptation when you watch one of these speeches is to treat every sentence as a hidden signal, and that is bad analysis. Most of what Putin said about the Russian economy and the Russian defense industry was, in substance, what he always says, that Russia is building weapons using its own technological base, that this is being financed by a stable economy, that the defense industry has become deeply integrated with the wider Russian war machine in ways that did not exist before 2022. This is true, by the way, as far as it goes, and I will come back to the production numbers in a moment, because they are genuinely important and genuinely underappreciated in Western commentary. But the section on the West was different in tone from the routine material. It did not draw a line between the United States and Europe. It spoke of NATO and the European Union as a single bloc engaged in a coordinated campaign of pressure against Russia, and it came packaged with an unmistakable historical frame. This is what they did to us before, and we are not going to be fooled twice. If this were an isolated data point, I would tell you to discount it heavily. Russian officials say dramatic things, constantly, and a great deal of it is theater for domestic consumption. But it is not isolated. In the days immediately preceding this speech, Putin met with Russia's Security Council and received what we are told was an unusually long briefing from Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. The Kremlin described this only as a foreign policy discussion and offered no further detail. We do not know exactly what was said in that room, but what we do know is that in the days following it, a cluster of senior Russian officials began saying, independently, but in remarkably consistent language, that the diplomatic track with the West is essentially finished. Lavrov has said publicly that Western efforts, mediation efforts in particular, to end the war in Ukraine have failed, and that it is not realistic to expect them to succeed because the West's credibility as a mediator has been, in his phrase, completely discredited. Yuri Ushakov, Putin's foreign policy aide, has separately indicated that Russia is no longer treating earlier US-brokered understandings as the operative framework and is instead waiting for its army to settle the matter on the battlefield. When you see 3 or 4 senior figures converge on the same message within the same week, immediately after a closed-door Security Council session, I think it is reasonable to treat that as coordinated rather than coincidental. Something was decided in that meeting. We are watching the public rollout of it, so here is the question I think we should actually be asking, and it is the question almost nobody in Western media is asking, because almost nobody in Western media is paying attention to these meetings at all. Does anyone seriously believe that the Kremlin, as currently postured, imagines a negotiated end to this war along anything like the lines the West has been proposing? I do not think the evidence supports that belief anymore. I think the working assumption inside the Russian state, at least for now, is that the war in Ukraine is no longer a discrete conflict to be settled through diplomacy, but one front, perhaps the active front, of a broader confrontation with the West that Moscow believes is already underway in all but name. That is a genuinely alarming conclusion, and I want to stress that I am not certain it is correct. Russian officials have an obvious incentive to project resolve, regardless of what they actually believe privately. But the consistency of the message across multiple speakers in the days right after that Security Council meeting is hard to wave away as noise. Now, here is the part that I think is the real paradox of this moment, and it is worth sitting with because it cuts against the instinctive narrative on both sides. Putin, in the same speech, was careful to say that Russia has no aggressive designs on the European members of NATO. He said this explicitly, and there is a strange asymmetry in where the openly aggressive rhetoric is actually coming from right now. It is Europe, not Russia, that has its senior military officials giving notably blunt warnings about preparing for confrontation. Germany's new army chief has made statements in the last period that were strikingly forceful, explicitly framed around the prospect of future war with Russia, and the Kremlin has taken public note of them. It is Europeans, not Russians, who have been actively encouraging Ukraine to strike deep inside Russian territory, and we have seen the consequences of that. A Storm Shadow missile strike, attributed to a British-supplied weapon, hit an electronics factory in Voronezh in the days before this speech, part of a longer pattern of Western-enabled drone and missile strikes reaching into Russian territory that the West has made no real secret of supporting. There has also been reporting, including in the Daily Telegraph, on British work to design and mass-produce cheap long-range missiles for Ukraine, with talk of using them against targets as far as Moscow itself. So, if you ask naively, which side is talking like it expects a war with the other, the honest answer is that an enormous amount of the apocalyptic language is coming out of European capitals, even as it is the Russians who are actually building the tanks. And this brings me to the part of the story that I think is the most underreported, and where I want to spend real time, because it is not really about rhetoric at all, it is about arithmetic. For the last 2 years, the consensus among serious defense economists, and I stress, this is not a partisan or pro-Russian claim. This comes from German officials, from NATO's own Secretary General, from Western institutes like Kiel, has been blunt. Russia has fully converted to a war economy, and its output now dwarfs Europe's. The figures that have circulated from German and NATO sources put it this way: Russia now produces in roughly 3 months what the entire European Union produces in a year, in terms of weapons and ammunition. Putin himself has claimed, and Western estimates broadly corroborate the direction, even if not every number, that since the start of 2022, Russia has roughly doubled tank production, more than quadrupled aircraft production, and increased strike weapon and ammunition output by a factor of more than 20. Estonian intelligence assessed that Russia produced something in the neighborhood of 7 million artillery, mortar, tank, and rocket rounds in 2025 alone, a figure that includes both domestic manufacture and continued imports from Iran and North Korea, although those imports have reportedly been declining. Compare that to the picture on the other side. Europe's flagship ammunition program aimed to reach roughly 2,155 mm shells a year by late 2025. The United States is targeting around 100,000 rounds a month in 2026, which works out to a bit over 1 million a year if they hit the target. Add Europe and America together optimistically, and you are still looking at a fraction of Russian output in a category of munitions that shell for shell costs Russia a fraction of what it costs NATO members to produce. This is not a uniform picture, and I want to be fair to the other side of the ledger because it does exist. European defense spending did rise sharply in 2025. By some measures, the sharpest increase since the end of the Cold War, and total European military spending now sits above $850 billion a year, which is not nothing. Some European production lines, particularly armored vehicles, have actually scaled up faster than Russia's. And there are credible voices, including senior EU officials, who argue that all this talk of an overwhelming Russian advantage is itself somewhat performative, a way of justifying further rearmament spending that serves bureaucratic and political interests as much as strategic ones. That critique is worth taking seriously, and I do not want to pretend the picture is one-sided propaganda from Moscow. But even granting every fair caveat, the structural reality that European institutes themselves have documented is this: Russia, adjusted for purchasing power, may now be spending as much on its military as the whole of Europe combined, while Europe's production base remains fragmented across dozens of national champions who would rather protect their own domestic contracts than build a single integrated supply chain. The European Union's own analysts at places like the Kiel Institute have concluded that meeting NATO's own readiness targets by 2030 would require something like a 5-fold increase in European defense production from where it stands today. A 5-fold increase while European industry is simultaneously living through what can only be described as a deindustrialization crisis in its civilian base. You cannot conjure a 5-fold increase in artillery output out of an economy that is simultaneously shutting down its smelters and its chemical plants for want of affordable energy. So, when European officials talk about preparing for a possible war with Russia by 2028, 2029, 2030, I think the honest response is to ask a hard question. Prepared with what? The spending lines exist on paper. The hardware in the quantities that would matter in an actual peer conflict does not yet exist on the factory floor. And the gap between announcement and delivery has so far been wide and slow to close. Meanwhile, the United States occupies a strange position in all this. America remains by a wide margin the most powerful military on Earth. Nobody serious disputes that. But it has just come through an extended and, by most honest accounts, frustrating confrontation with Iran. American and Israeli forces struck Iran in February. The war dragged on for months, burned through substantial portions of American precision munitions stockpiles, and concluded not with Iranian capitulation, but with a fragile memorandum of understanding that both sides are already interpreting in incompatible ways. Just this week in Switzerland, Vice President Vance held a new round of talks with Iranian negotiators at the Bergenstock Resort above Lake Lucerne, and the readouts genuinely do not match. Vance told reporters that Iran had agreed to let International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back into the country and called it a major milestone toward ending Iran's nuclear weapons program. Within hours, Iran's foreign ministry spokesman was on Iranian state television saying nothing of the kind had been agreed, that Iran's cooperation with the IAEA would continue exactly as before under existing parliamentary restrictions, and that the nuclear file was simply not discussed during 18 hours of talks. Washington also announced a temporary 60-day license allowing Iranian oil exports to resume, and both sides set up a so-called deconfliction mechanism to manage the still live fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon. Fighting that has continued throughout these talks despite the supposed ceasefire. So what we actually have, 4 months after the war started, is not peace. It is a fragile pause, contested on its own terms by the two parties who supposedly agreed to it, while a parallel war continues next door. And while serious people in Washington and Moscow alike seem to believe this pause is less a path to settlement than an interval the United States is using to rebuild stockpiles before a possible third round. If you are sitting in the Kremlin watching this, the lesson is not complicated. If the most powerful military on the planet could not force a clean resolution against Iran, a country with a fraction of Russia's conventional capability, none of Russia's nuclear arsenal, and none of its space and early warning infrastructure, then the calculus around actually fighting Russia becomes a great deal less attractive. I am not saying this is the only consideration shaping American strategic thinking, but I think it helps explain why, even as European rhetoric escalates, you do not see a corresponding American eagerness to be the country that turns the proxy war in Ukraine into a direct one. Let me turn briefly to Britain because there is a domestic political story unfolding there that intersects with this in an interesting way. Keir Starmer announced his resignation as Labour leader and Prime Minister on the 22nd of June, 2 days ago, after Andy Burnham, the Mayor of Greater Manchester, engineered his own return to Parliament through a by-election his own party deliberately vacated for him, won it comfortably, and was sworn in as an MP the same day Starmer announced he was stepping down. Starmer is not leaving immediately. He has asked Labour's National Executive Committee to set a timetable, with nominations opening on the 9th of July, and the contest required to conclude by the 16th, before Parliament's summer recess. Specifically, so the country is not left leaderless through the summer. Burnham has confirmed he is running and has already picked up the backing of Wes Streeting, previously seen as a possible rival. Here is the detail that matters strategically, rather than just as palace gossip. Even though Starmer is going, he remains Prime Minister until the contest concludes, and in that window he still intends to attend a NATO summit and announce Britain's headline defense spending commitments, decisions that will bind whoever succeeds him. The outgoing leader is locking in the architecture of British defense policy on his way out the door, without his presumptive successor having any real say in shaping it. That is the broader pattern across the continent right now, not just in Britain. Governments committing to enormous multi-year increases in defense spending at the precise moment their industrial bases are contracting with very little public accounting for how the spending will translate into actual production capacity rather than headline figures. I think that gap between the rhetoric of rearmament and what European factories can currently deliver is going to be one of the defining vulnerabilities of the next several years, regardless of what Russia does or does not do. Now, let me bring this back to the battlefield itself, because the war in Ukraine has not paused for any of this, and the situation in the eastern Donbass region has become genuinely serious, even if the precise framing matters enormously here, and I want to be more careful on this point than some commentary has been. The focal point right now is the city of Kostyantynivka, sometimes written Konstantinovka, a city that sits at the heart of what Ukraine calls its fortress belt, the line of cities including Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, and Druzhkivka that has anchored Ukrainian defense in Donetsk for years. I want to be precise about the state of the fighting there because Russian and Ukrainian sources disagree sharply, and the truth, as best as independent open-source analysts can establish it, sits between the two. Russian forces have been infiltrating the city since roughly the start of June, pushing in from the east through a village called Novodmitrivka and from other directions simultaneously. By the middle of June, independent trackers estimated something on the order of 100 to 130 Russian soldiers operating inside different parts of the urban area, some controlling individual buildings or stairwells scattered across the city rather than holding any single contiguous zone. The commander of the Ukrainian Corps, responsible for defending the city, has stated explicitly, as of the most recent reporting available, that despite this infiltration, no part of the city is under Russian control. Russian state media, for its part, has released a great deal of footage showing soldiers raising flags in various districts, a tactic Russia has used in city after city throughout this war, specifically to manufacture the visual impression of total control, even where the actual situation on the ground is messier and more contested. Independent analysts at the Institute for the Study of War have made the same observation, that Russian reporting tends to inflate the apparent scale of its presence relative to what is independently verifiable. So, I think the honest assessment, as of right now, is not that Kostiantynivka has fallen, and not that Russia controls it, but that Russia has broken through the outer defensive crust and established a persistent, distributed infiltration inside the city in a pattern that mirrors almost exactly how the much larger city of Pokrovsk fell earlier this year, through gradual urban infiltration and logistic strangulation, rather than a single, decisive battle. Ukrainian brigade officers defending the city say they are inflicting disproportionate casualties on the infiltrating Russian units, claiming several hundred Russian dead in a single month in one brigade sector alone, and they argue this is not yet a repeat of Pokrovsk if they can seal the gaps Russian troops are using to enter. Whether they can do that is honestly an open question, and Ukrainian military observers themselves have warned publicly that Russia could plausibly take the city by the end of this summer. What is not in serious dispute is the broader trajectory. Russian forces have, over the preceding months, captured the Klibanbek reservoir south of the city, struck a dam in a way that flooded and cut a key supply road, and concentrated a very large force, on the order of 11,000 troops by Ukrainian estimates, specifically in the Kostiantynivka-Druzhkivka sector, because Russian command appears to have concluded that a direct push towards Slovyansk further north was not working and has redirected its main effort here instead. This is, by multiple independent assessments, now the central axis of Russia's summer 2026 offensive. If Kostiantynivka falls, the road network connecting it to Kramatorsk and Druzhkivka becomes far more exposed, and the entire fortress belt becomes harder to hold as a connected system rather than a set of isolated strongpoints. That is the real military stake here, more than the city itself. I will say one more thing about the wider front line that I think the more alarmist commentary tends to flatten. It is true that Russia continues to hold the initiative in the east, and that the fall of further Donbas towns this summer or autumn is a real possibility rather than a remote one. But it is also true and verifiable from open-source military analysis that across the roughly 1,200-kilometer front as a whole, the dramatic territorial gains that characterize 2024 and parts of 2025 have slowed considerably, and that Ukraine has, in some sectors, actually recaptured more ground than it lost in recent months, with Ukrainian command claiming over 600 sq kilometers of net territorial recovery since the start of the year, concentrated in areas like western Zaporizhia. Neither side currently has the operational capacity, on the evidence available, to force a decisive breakthrough across the front as a whole. What we are watching is not a collapsing Ukrainian line everywhere, but a war of attrition that happens to be running hot in one specific, strategically important sector, the Donbas fortress belt, while remaining comparatively static elsewhere. I think it is important to hold both of those facts at once, rather than letting the genuine seriousness of the Kostiantynivka situation collapse into a narrative of total Ukrainian collapse, which the evidence does not support, or letting the static front line elsewhere obscure how serious the Donbas situation actually is, which would be equally wrong. Let me say something finally about the Russian economy, because Putin's claim in that same speech that the Russian economy remains stable and capable of sustaining this entire military buildup is a claim that deserves scrutiny, rather than either reflexive belief or reflexive dismissal. The honest picture, as best as outside analysts can construct it from Russian central bank data and independent reporting, is mixed and more interesting than either side of the propaganda war wants to admit. Western sanctions have had a real effect on the Russian economy, but arguably not the effect that was originally intended. By trapping enormous amounts of capital inside Russia's borders, the sanctions regime appears to have fed an investment boom inside the country, alongside genuine increases in living standards for large parts of the population, even as it has also visibly distorted the structure of that economy toward military production and away from civilian investment. Russia continues to experience the kind of seasonal gasoline supply stress that in most years is a fairly routine consequence of limited refining capacity, rather than a sign of imminent economic collapse. Although Ukrainian strikes on Russian refining infrastructure have added a genuinely new and harder to dismiss variable to that picture this year. The Russian central bank's decision earlier this month to cut its key interest rate only marginally, from 15% to 14.5%, drew real frustration from within Russia's own business community, who argue the central bank is keeping monetary policy too tight for too long, sacrificing growth in pursuit of an inflation target it may already be on track to undershoot rather than overshoot next year. None of this amounts to the imminent economic crisis that some Western commentary likes to predict on a roughly quarterly basis. But none of it amounts to the picture of a fully thriving, frictionless war economy either. It is an economy that has adapted at real cost and is being managed by a central bank that, on the evidence, appears to be erring on the side of caution to the point of restraining growth it could otherwise be capturing. So, where does this leave us? A speech was given in Moscow yesterday that, read alongside a closed-door Security Council meeting, and a coordinated round of statements from Russia's foreign policy establishment in the days since, suggests the Kremlin has concluded, at least for now, that diplomacy with the West has run its course, and that the war in Ukraine is increasingly understood inside Russia not as a discrete conflict, but as one theater of a wider confrontation it believes the West has already chosen to escalate toward. Whether that belief is accurate is a separate question from whether Russian officials hold it. And the evidence that they hold it, at least rhetorically, and quite possibly as genuine internal assessment, is now fairly strong. At the same time, the material balance underlying all this rhetoric is genuinely lopsided in ways that should worry European planners more than it currently seems to. Russia's war economy, whatever its real internal strains, is producing hardware at a scale Europe is not close to matching, while European governments commit to enormous future spending increases that their own analysts say would require a five-fold expansion of an industrial base currently shrinking rather than growing. The United States, chastened by an inconclusive and costly confrontation with a far weaker adversary, shows little appetite to be the actor that turns this into a direct great power war, even as it keeps arming Ukraine and talking tough. And in the one sector of the battlefield where Russia is genuinely making serious, strategically significant progress, the Donbas fortress belt around Kostiantynivka, the situation is worse than Ukrainian officials want to admit, but not yet as conclusive as Russian state media claims. I do not think any of this points toward an imminent, deliberate Russian attack on a NATO member state, and it would be irresponsible to imply otherwise on the strength of one speech, however striking. What I think it points toward is something more unsettling in a quieter way. A Russian leadership that has, rightly or wrongly, concluded the diplomatic door with the West is effectively closed, organizing its industrial base and its public rhetoric around the assumption of prolonged confrontation rather than negotiated settlement. At precisely the moment European governments are loud proclaiming preparations for a war they currently lack the industrial capacity to fight, and an American administration that has just discovered in Iran the limits of what even its formidable military can guarantee. That combination is not a recipe for war tomorrow, but it is a recipe for a long, dangerous, and badly managed stretch of years ahead, and it deserves a great deal more sustained attention than one speech in the Kremlin on one Tuesday in June is likely to receive. That is where I will leave things for today. As always, thank you for spending this time with me, and I will be back soon with more.